This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Jill Newbronner, and here are tonight's top stories from East Asia. The United States and Australia doubling down on what they call China's coercive behavior. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin flags more American maritime patrols, reconnaissance and bomber aircraft flying from Australian bases. A former Taiwanese soldier finally home 5 months after being rescued and then being detained by Chinese authorities after his boat failed on a fishing trip. A U.S. state court finds a prominent academic guilty of spying for Chinese intelligence services while living a double life as a pro-democracy activist. And the yen's rally comes to an abrupt stop after the Bank of Japan said it will refrain from hiking interest rates when markets are volatile. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris picks Tim Walz, a governor with China ties, as her vice presidential running mate. If elected, how would the pair likely shape U.S. foreign policy? We'll have an expert weigh in. America is boosting its military presence in Australia. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says there will be an increase in rotational American forces, meaning more maritime patrol, reconnaissance and bomber aircraft flying from northern Australian bases. Now, this with an eye on China's activities in the region. That's the latest from the country's yearly defense talks. There are no U.S. military bases in Australia, but the northern city of Darwin hosts a U.S. Marine rotational force. And Washington is building facilities for its Marines and visiting air squadrons within Australian bases. Defense Minister Richard Marles said American forces in Australia help with deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, and this is an enormous opportunity to work with Australia's neighbours. Roger Maynard has more on what came out of the ministerial talks in Maryland.
Well, the Osmond talks have reinforced the United States' commitment to promoting what it calls a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific region, with a clear resolve to maintaining a long-term presence of Australian and US aircraft in this part of the world. There was no doubt who this message was aimed at, with the two allies emphasising they had shared security challenges, including what they called coercive behaviour by China. In a statement released afterwards, the two countries expressed concern over Chinese military activity around Taiwan, as well as China's excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea. They also noted grave concern about what they called China's dangerous and escalatory behaviour towards Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. But it was Australia and America's more significant military role in the region that has attracted the headlines here. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin revealed there would be an increase in the presence of rotational forces in Australia, with more maritime patrol aircraft and reconnaissance planes operating from bases across northern Australia. At the same time, Australia will begin co-manufacturing guided missiles with the United States from next year, including the guided multiple launch rocket systems used in Ukraine. It was also revealed that Australia is testing a hypersonic attack cruise missile with the United States. Now, Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles said the presence of American force posture in Australia provided an enormous opportunity to work with our neighbours in the region. Interestingly, there was also mention of a military upgrade in the Cocos Islands, which is an Australian territory in the Indian Ocean nearly 1,900 miles off the mainland. Now, this tiny island outpost, which is nearer to Indonesia than the Australian mainland, is key to Australia's maritime surveillance operation in the Indian Ocean, and where China is believed to be increasing its submarine activity. Australia will start building an expanded airfield on the Cocos later this year, allowing it to accommodate heavier military aircraft, including the submarine-hunting P-8A Poseidon. All in all, the Osmond talks were aimed at reassuring the region as a whole, with both sides emphasising Southeast Asia's importance to regional stability and prosperity. Sea. And that, it said, involved a shared commitment to work bilaterally and with partners in supporting the region's economic, development and security priorities, they made clear in a statement. Roger Maynard, CNA, Sydney.
Meanwhile, China's military has conducted a joint sea and air patrol around the Scarborough Shoal in the disputed South China Sea. The Chinese Southern Theatre Command said on social media the drill is aimed at testing the rapid mobility and strike capabilities of its troops. In reference to the presence of other militaries in the region, it stressed that activities that undermine peace and disrupt the situation in the South China Sea are fully under the Theatre Command's control. Now, this all comes as the Philippines, the US, Canada and Australia began holding their first joint military exercises in the waterway. The four-nation maneuvers are being held within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, which includes the contested waters. China's so-called 10-dash line also cuts through that area. A joint statement says the group is standing together to address common maritime challenges and underscore their shared dedication to upholding international law and the rules-based order. Now, the two-day drills involve both naval and air force units. A Filipino spokesperson described it as a multilateral maritime cooperative activity that's aimed at enhancing cooperation and interoperability between the participating countries' armed forces. The US has held similar exercises with other countries, including Japan, along the disputed waterways. A joint Coast Guard exercise is scheduled off Manila Bay on Friday between the Philippines and Vietnam. It will be the first ever drills between these two Southeast Asian nations. Adding on to tensions in the South China Sea, the Philippine Navy claims that Beijing has finished constructing a fully functioning military base on Subi Reef. The Navy's spokesperson, Rear Admiral Roy Vincent Trinidad, on Tuesday said Beijing has been expanding their naval and air force capabilities, quote, little by little. Manila believes that Subi Reef is now stocked with China's fuel and weapons, ready for use. The Philippine Navy also accused China of taking up roughly 3,000 hectares in the South China Sea, including their own waters. Located in the Spratly Islands, Subi Reef lies outside of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It remains a grey territory because it is also just 12 to 15 miles from the Pagasa Island. Manila and Beijing claim many of the same shoals, namely the Second Thomas and Sabina shoals in this waterway as their own. Both have accused the other of illegally deploying Coast Guard vessels and expanding their outposts. Vietnam has also been increasing its presence in the disputed area. By the beginning half of this year, Hanoi constructed an extra 280 hectares of land. Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative says Vietnam now controls the fourth largest outpost in the archipelago, next to China, ranking third. Despite overlapping claims in the Spratly chain, Vietnam's island building hasn't ruffled Manila's feathers. Instead, both countries empathize that China increasing assertiveness at sea is of grave concern and stronger cooperation is needed. China hasn't made any direct responses yet, but for a long time, they have rebuked, quote, groundless accusations made by countries like the Philippines and have claimed that their actions in the South China Sea always uphold international laws. Now, authorities in China have released a former Taiwanese army officer after detaining him for veering off into Chinese territorial waters during a fishing trip back in March. Known only by his surname Hu, the 25-year-old was welcomed by his family members after spending nearly 6 months in detention. He had initially returned to Taiwan as of March the 23rd, but was detained due to Beijing's claims that he had intentionally concealed information about his military service. Mr. Hu's family had secured a voluntary discharge from the armed forces, which came into effect in May. It was only last week that representatives from China and Taiwan reached a settlement on his release.
顺利解决就好。
Mr. Hu was one of two fishermen rescued by Chinese Coast Guards when their boat lost power in Weitou Bay, a stretch of water that separates the Taiwanese-controlled island of Quemoy, also known as Kinmen, and the mainland province of Fujian. The decision follows a flurry of diplomacy between China and Taiwan. Now, both sides hatched a deal to return the bodies of two Chinese fishermen back to mainland China. Earlier this year, the two men died in waters near Kinmen after their boat capsized during a pursuit by Taiwanese Coast Guard boats. Now, Taiwan has agreed to compensate the victims' families as well as repatriate their bodies following multiple rounds of talks. Let's get more from Victoria Jen joining us from Taipei. Victoria, first of all, talk us through how both sides reached this point.
Well, the Taiwanese fisherman, surnamed Hu, is a former army officer. And the reason why he was being detained by the Chinese authorities is primarily because of his military background. Now, his release came shortly after Taiwan and China reached an agreement over the return of the bodies of the two Chinese fishermen who died in a boat chase by Taiwan Coast Guard. Now, this incident actually escalated tensions across the Taiwan Strait. China had initially called this a malicious and violent act, and it has even increased patrols around Taiwan during this period. But now that a consensus has been reached, China is actually showing a sign of a goodwill gesture by releasing the Taiwanese fishermen. But what we need to watch out for after this is that whether or not China is going to release the 5 fishermen from Taiwan that are currently being detained by China over the alleged illegal fishing in the Chinese territorial water last month. And what we also need to watch out for is that whether or not China is going to ease restrictions on Chinese tour groups to Taiwan. Now, if the two sides are willing to take a step back, we could expect a silver lining in the cross-strait development.
That's what I was going to say, a sliver of hope, at least, from China. How do you see cross-strait ties progressing and moving forward after this?
Well, it may seem like it's moving in the positive direction, but it's still too early to tell because after all these exchanges and communications between the two sides are over unofficial channels. And now, even though the two sides are willing to talk over humanitarian issues, but that does not mean that they're willing to talk over political issues. Now, China has insisted that Taiwan must accept the One China principle in order for the two sides to return to the negotiation table. But remember that China has cut off all official exchanges between the two sides since 2016, when then President Tsai Ing-wen took office, and she rejected the One China principle. Things are unlikely to change under William Lai, the current president, because he insisted that PRC and the ROC are not subordinate over each other. And so this remark is actually being interpreted by Beijing as meaning two countries. And so that is why Beijing labeled him as a separatist and because of his hardline pro-independence position. So unless William Lai is willing to soften his stance, the chances of the two sides resuming talks are likely to be very slim.
Understood. Thank you very much, Victoria Jen in Taipei reporting there. Coming up on East Asia tonight, it's a busy earnings day with some of Japan's biggest conglomerates such as SoftBank and Sony announcing their quarterly results. Leadership change at Southeast Asia's biggest bank, DBS. CEO Piyush Gupta will retire after more than a decade at the helm. We'll tell you who's lined up to succeed him after this.
Apa khabar semua?
The race to be Southeast Asia's hub for artificial intelligence.
Malaysia is ready for the digital economy, and our government is going to take all steps necessary to make sure.
From attracting billion-dollar investments to weaving AI into everyday lives.
So, I see that we're now being turned into a cartoon.
Can Malaysia make its AI dream a reality? Tonight on CNA.
Saturday on Japan Hour.
絶品の味を求めて県外からも多くの客がやってきます。
白い飴絶対食べれないですよね。
ここ1年で過去最多の802件、後継者不足が大きな要因の一つと言われています。
こいつには教えたくないってやついっぱいいましたよ。お金のことばっかりで。
みんなにこう親しまれた味っていうのをきっちり残していきたい。
Japan Hour, Saturday on CNA. Japan Hour is brought to you by Sumitomo Corporation. MUFG, committed to empowering a brighter future. Zip Air, summer fares are now available. And iChai.
Thank you for 25 years of sports news, global headlines, and local stories. Here's to celebrating your achievements and understanding Asia. Happy 25th anniversary, CNA.
His art has since matured tremendously.
But for me, there was always something missing. So when I started dancing walking, I found that missing thing.
I hope I get scouted from national teams so I could make the Filipinos proud, or Filipinas.
If Robert had never come into my life, what would happen? How would we have struggled? Like, how would we have come from out of all these things?
Most of the time, we feel like we're running after him. We can't keep up.
Never give up.
Never give up.
You're watching East Asia Tonight. We bring on Roland Lim from CNA's Business Desk. Roland, a lackluster trade in China today?
Yes, lackluster trade indeed, but we are starting off with Southeast Asia's leadership change. There is sparking we should be talking about DBS, but let's talk about China first. Exports in July missing expectations. This is sparking concerns on whether exports could give the country a much-needed boost to reach its GDP target this year. Now, outbound shipments rose 7% on year in July by value, undershooting expectations for 9.5% increase. There's also far slower than the 8.6% gains recorded in the month of June. Now, US dollar-denominated imports beat estimates, rising more than 7% on year. Now, trade surplus narrowed to about $84 billion. Overseas shipments have been a rare bright spot in China's economy so far this year amid weak domestic demand. A fourth straight month of export gains would have fueled optimism for the country's economic outlook. But uncertainties also loom as China continues to fend off various trade restrictions imposed against it, amid worries over the nation's industrial overcapacity. Quick check on the Greater China markets. Looking up as the latest trade figures show that China's July imports exceeded expectations. Hang Seng Index snapping a 4-day losing streak, rising 1.4% today, recovering from a 3-month low. Tech stocks there were the biggest winners. Shanghai Composite ending the day largely unchanged, but the second more Shenzhen component did dip a little. Stocks in East Asia climbing back after some early selling. Sentiment in Japanese markets improved after Bank of Japan's Deputy Governor Shinichi Uchida pledged to refrain from hiking rates when financial markets are unstable. The Nikkei 225 average jumped about 1.2% at the close. The yen, meantime, is weaker against the greenback by more than 2%, 147.44 to $1. Japanese authorities said they spent almost $41 billion when they stepped up in the forex markets in April to prop up the yen. That's the highest amount they've spent so far. The yen has fallen sharply then to 155 to the dollar, and 2 rounds of intervention then helped push the yen up by about 5%. More market action for the rest of East Asia, the Kospi ending higher by 1.8% today, led by heavyweight Samsung Electronics. Its stock rallied following a Reuters report that its memory chips passed NVIDIA's test to use it in its AI processors. A Japanese technology investor, SoftBank Group, plans to buy back a hefty $3.4 billion in shares. It's part of an attempt to address calls from Elliott Management and other investors to bolster its share price. The tech giant has been under pressure to buy back shares as its market cap is trading at a large discount to the combined value of its assets. Over the next year, SoftBank will buy back up to 6.8% of its shares. A U.S. activist fund, Elliott, has reportedly pressured SoftBank to spend $15 billion to buy back shares after amassing a stake exceeding some $2 billion. SoftBank founder and CEO Masayoshi Son, famous for its early bets on Alibaba, has had to scale back on tech investments these past few years. Now, the investment behemoth has about $26 billion in cash at the end of March. SoftBank announced the buyback when it reported its first quarter earnings. Net loss for the period ended June narrowed to about $1.19 billion from $3.25 billion a year ago. Its Vision Fund segment swung to a loss of $1.39 billion from a profit of $416 million. And that's due to the lower share prices of publicly listed portfolio companies and markdowns at unlisted startups that SoftBank's invested in. SoftBank shares closing more than 5% higher before the results were announced. They have gained nearly 25% so far this year, despite a record plunge on Monday amid a global market meltdown. More earnings news for you. Sony raises its full-year net profit forecast to $6.7 billion as it expects strong sales in its gaming, music, and image sensor businesses. Now, that's compared with a previous estimate of $6.3 billion. The conglomerate's upbeat outlook comes after it reported a positive result. Net profit rose 6.5% on year in the first quarter, beating market estimates. A strong performance bolstered by favorable exchange rates and higher sales in Sony's industry-leading image sensor business. Sony is a major supplier of image sensors for smartphone makers, and profit for sales of sensors roughly tripled to $250 million. But the company only sold 2.4 million units of its aging PlayStation 5 console, significantly below the 3 million that analysts had expected. The decline comes as the gaming industry is grappling with rising costs and weak pricing power. Sony shares closing flat ahead of the earnings announcement and is down 6% year to date. It's a mixed set of results at Cathay Pacific Airways. The carrier's first half revenue rose, but profits slipped as the airline fell while costs rose. Even then, the airline declared an interim dividend, citing strong performance as it looks to expand its fleet. Revenue for the first half advanced nearly 14% to about $6.4 billion as travel demand remained robust. Profit, however, fell more than 15% on year to around $462 million. And that's as airfares normalized, while the costs of operating more flights had surged some 42.7%. Now, air ticket prices gained altitude after pandemic curbs were lifted as carriers took time to restart idled planes and to recruit new crew members. But as that supply crunch eased, airfares have fallen. Despite the mixed results, Cathay Pacific declared an interim dividend of 20 Hong Kong cents a share. It also announced plans to buy 30 Airbus A330-900 aircrafts. The basic price, about $11 billion. The carrier said it's on track to meet its goal of reaching 100% of its pre-pandemic flights in the first quarter of next year. Cathay Pacific shares reversed earlier gains after the earnings report, ending nearly 2.4% in the red. Southeast Asia's biggest lender, DBS, says that its CEO, Piyush Gupta, will retire next March after the annual general meeting today. And this will mark the end of his tenure at the bank, which he would have helmed for 16 years by then. Now, DBS says Tan Su San, the current group of the head of institutional banking, will be appointed as deputy CEO and to succeed Mr. Gupta. DBS made the announcement after reporting higher net profits in the second quarter, fueled by record income from its wealth management business and lending. Net profit in the quarter rose 4% on year to 2.8 billion Singapore dollars, beating estimates. But compared to the previous quarter's record, net profit was 5% lower. Net interest income from its lending activities increased 5% on year to 3.8 billion Singapore dollars. And this comes on the back of higher net interest margins. The bank's net fee income did rise 27% on year to a record slightly more than 1 billion Singapore dollars. But the bank is warning of heightened uncertainty on the back of recent market volatility and ongoing geopolitical tensions. The leadership announcement came after the close of trade in Singapore. Now, earlier, DBS shares ended the day higher, as did other Singapore banks. The best gainers of the day, DBS up 2.8%, followed by OCBC 1.59%, UOB up by 0.2% today. Stay tuned for DBS's succession coming up in the bulletin.
That's right, Roland. We have got more on that. In fact, we got our reporter joining us later in the show to tell us more about this leadership change. So stay tuned for that. Also, coming up on East Asia tonight, U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris picks Governor Tim Walz, known for his China ties, as a VP running mate. How will this duo shape U.S. foreign policy? If elected, we'll have insights from Adrian Ang Yu Jin, research fellow and coordinator of United States Program Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, RSIS. The United States and Australia doubling down on what they call China's coercive behavior. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says there'll be more American maritime patrol reconnaissance and bomber aircraft flying from Australian bases. A former Taiwanese soldier finally going home 5 months after he was rescued by the Chinese Coast Guard after his boat failed on a fishing trip. The yen's rally comes to an abrupt stop after the Bank of Japan said it will refrain from hiking interest rates when markets are volatile. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has picked Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, as her running mate in a bid for the White House. He was chosen from nearly a dozen candidates before Ms. Harris narrowed the choice to a handful she felt she could be a governing partner. The pair appeared at a rally in Philadelphia for the first time as the Democratic ticket. According to Ms. Harris, he's delivered for working families and will fight for America's middle class.
Tim Walz and I, we agree about many things, including when our middle class is strong, America is strong. And strengthening the middle class will be my defining goal as I am President of the United States.
Minnesota's strength comes from our values, our commitment to working together, to seeing past our differences, to always being willing to lend a helping hand. Those are the same values I learned on the family farm and tried to instill in my students. I took it to Congress and to the state capitol, and now Vice President Harris and I are running to take those very values to the White House.
Walz was a football coach, school teacher, National Guard veteran, congressman, and now a second-term governor. He's helped enact the ambitious Democratic agenda for his state, including sweeping protections for abortion rights and generous aid to families. More importantly, Ms. Harris is hoping the 60-year-old will give her campaign a boost across the Midwest states of Michigan and Wisconsin as rival Republican Donald Trump zeroes in on them, including Minnesota. Republicans have described their rivals as liberal far left and take aim at Walz's track record.
My view on it is it just highlights how radical Kamala Harris is. This is a person who listened to the Hamas wing of her own party and selecting a nominee. This is a guy who's proposed shipping more manufacturing jobs to China, who wants to make the American people more reliant on garbage energy instead of good American energy, and has proposed defunding the police just as Kamala Harris does.
So it's all heating up. Let's get more from Dr. Adrian Ang Yu Jin from the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, RSIS. He is research fellow and coordinator at the United States program there. Adrian, as you watch the two of them at the Philadelphia rally, your thoughts first on the strengths and weaknesses of a Harris-Walz pairing.
So Walz was an initial dark horse candidate, but, you know, he is very popular among the Democratic elites who have now rallied around Vice President Harris's choice. And so we can expect them to have a very raucous reception at the Democratic convention in about 2 weeks. But, you know, so Walz, you know, even with his folksy, populist Midwest charm, is not from Minnesota. Right, so it's outside, as your introduction pointed out, from the key Democratic blue firewall states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So going with Tim Walz rather than, say, you know, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, who was also one of the favorites to be Harris's VP candidate, right, is a calculated risk. Of course.
Okay, one of the interesting things I find about Walz, one of the interesting things is his connections with China. He has ties to China. He taught there for a year. I'm wondering if these connections are significant enough to perhaps inform more China-friendly policies.
So we also have to remember that, Tim Walz was in China a very long time ago.
Yeah.
So this was in the late 1980s. And that is a very, very different China. So he was in China in around the time of Tiananmen, and he stayed on after Tiananmen, right? So it's a very different China, but he has, from all we know, right, kept up an interest in China, right? And especially on human rights issues, right? So if that is correct, we're probably not going to see a more China-friendly policy coming from a Harris-Walz administration.
Okay, so that leads into my next question, because under Trump, in Asia, we worried about trade, we worried about the state of investment with the U.S. What do you think Asia will have to worry about under Harris-Walz? Or do you think it's more a BAU case, continuity from the Biden administration?
So I think it will be more a case of, as you put it, BAU, business as usual. Secretary of State Blinken was just here in Singapore last week, and one of his key messages was there was going to be continuity in U.S. foreign policy towards Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, regardless of whether it's going to be a Democratic or a Republican administration. So I know, there are concerns about, what a Trump 2.0 administration might do in terms of trade and economics. But I think, we also run the risk of, going too far and possibly exaggerating how much discontinuity there might be in a second Trump administration.
Really? Do you feel that that's unfounded fears about the discontinuity? Because the fact is, the U.S. was already defensively overstretched, even before the unrest in the Middle East and the unrest in Ukraine. And you've actually agreed on previous interviews that the U.S. has to prioritize. They have to choose and they have to do less. So will Harris really prioritize Asia? Can she afford not to prioritize Asia, especially with China, Taiwan, North Korea going on?
So you're correct. I have argued previously that the U.S. has to strategize, it has to prioritize. But of course, every new administration will have a strategy, but that strategy, once it meets, a crisis in some other part of the world, that's when the challenges come in. But one of the things, a new administration, regardless of whether it is Harris or Trump, will have to face its fiscal constraints. So, we have the U.S. national debt, reaching a point where it's close to being unsustainable, right? So interest rates are soon going to be, either the largest component of the federal budget. So, like it or not, the U.S. is going to have to prioritize.
Let's talk about specifics. Japan, key linchpin for the U.S. in Asia. Now, Japan, on the surface says, hey, bilateral relations won't be affected regardless of who comes to power. But behind the scenes, do you think it's a very different story? Because we've seen Japan reach out to Trump in the person of former Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso, who actually reached out to Trump in New York a couple of months ago. So how do you think a Harris presidency may actually affect U.S.-Japan ties?
So I don't think a Harris administration will affect U.S.-Japan ties very much. Again, just this past weekend, last week, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin were in Japan. They also announced, sort of a key initiative where the U.S. is transforming its military command in Japan to a joint force command, even as Japan is also moving towards its own joint command. So that is something I expect, a Harris administration, if there is one, to pursue. And I also expect, a Trump administration to also, pursue a very similar policy.
All right, let's see if we can get through 2 more questions in 2 minutes. India's Modi, he's had a good rapport with Trump in the past. Harris, yes, cultural ties, but she's very outspoken about issues like Kashmir, which irritates India somewhat, but India is needed in the Quad. Very complex dynamics at play here. What do you think is going to happen?
So again, you are correct. The U.S. needs India in the Quad. The U.S. views India as a strategic counterweight to China. And, it's not just Harris. The U.S. has had its ups and downs with India, right, regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India buying cheap oil from Russia, and also an alleged assassination plot of a Sikh U.S. citizen in the U.S., right? So, but all those things have been smoothed over because both sides understand the importance of this strategic relationship, and they are pragmatic about it rather than being dogmatic about it.
All right. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it here for now. Do want to thank you, though, Dr. Adrian Ang Eugene, Research Fellow and Coordinator of United States Program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, RSIS. Coming up on East Asia tonight, a U.S. state court convicts an academic known publicly as a pro-democracy activist of spying for Chinese intelligence.
Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's National Day message will be shown tomorrow at 6:45 p.m. on CNA. The message will be available on the following websites after the telecast.
Welcome to India. மகாபலிபுரத்தில் கல்ச்சர் ரொம்ப ஸ்பெஷல். 15 years முன்னாடி 5 men சர்வ் பண்ணிட்டு இருந்தாங்க. அவங்க கிட்ட போர்டு வாங்கிட்டு ஒரு 5 பேர் ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணோம் சர்ஃபிங் கோவத்தில்.
From Mahabalipuram, an ancient temple city, to Mahas, a surfer's paradise. There's truly no other street like this.
Our idea is very simple. We selected 6 children and 6 seniors and matched them as new friends.
你喜欢吃什么
Ramen.
Okay, you sing then, let me hear.
Over the course of the 10 weeks, we want to see if these young children and seniors can really become good friends.
I love you.
Wow, so do I.
When they come together, they learn to respect each other for who they are.
It fosters a deeper understanding for the elderly and the children. This is teaching the younger generation to love the elderly.
Uncle Thomas, I give you.
I think it doesn't really matter whether you're young or old, whether you are of different backgrounds. Invaluable friendships can manifest in the most unlikely places.
Welcome back as we circle back to the leadership change at DBS. Group CEO Piyush Gupta is set to retire after the next annual general meeting. That's on the 28th of March next year. Tan Soo Chan, currently the group head of institutional banking, is appointed the deputy CEO and will succeed Mr. Gupta then. CNA's Rebecca Mateo joins us live for the very latest. Rebecca, first, the highlights from that briefing.
All right, my colleague and I were gathered here supposedly for a results briefing on the bank's earnings in the second quarter. So in the briefing room just now, we saw DBS top leadership CEO Piyush Gupta, its Chief Financial Officer Cheng Sok Hui, as well as fellow reporters from the various media. And the briefing just ended a while ago. But on top of DBS announcing its strong performance in its second quarter earnings, we were also handed out the news that DBS will soon see its new CEO. And a bit of background before we jump onto the new CEO, a bit of background about its current CEO Piyush Gupta is that he has been the CEO of the group for more than a decade, and he is the longest serving DBS chief in history. And the 64-year-old, actually, he led the bank to be the first to enter the mobile wallet market in Singapore, known as the PayLah, which we are very familiar by now. And that happened about more than a decade ago. And also, since Piyush Gupta took over in 2009, he has its return of equity, which is a measurement of its financial performance, has also more than doubled to over 18% lately, and it started from 2009 at about 9%, and we did a measurement across the banks, and it's not that we see the same performance across banks in the same period of time. And he also expanded the banking services to 19 markets, which includes India, Vietnam, and today the bank has now become the largest lender in Southeast Asia.
So our business plans for next year, our capital management strategies, our strategic direction, I'm going to let her increasingly take ownership and onus for driving that. While I focus on making sure that we can deliver this year to its completion. But we will play, tag team for the next few months so that she gets every opportunity to figure out and get comfortable with all of the moving parts that are required to run a bank of this size.
Tag team, Piyush Gupta called it. So tell us about the second half of the tag team, incoming CEO Tan Su Shan.
Right, Joel. Actually, before today, there have been lots of speculations on the ground, and people were wondering who the next DBS CEO will be and when this will happen. So the elephant in the room just now was really addressing the topic on leadership succession, which was announced. And as we all have heard, Tan Su Shan will eventually become the CEO of DBS. And this makes her the second woman in the banking industry here to hold that top position. And she has more than 35 years of experience in consumer banking, wealth management, as well as institutional banking. And she comes with she also brings with her a wealth of experience, with experience from the financial markets in Hong Kong, London, and Tokyo. And she joined DBS more than a decade ago and spent her initial years building on the foundation of wealth management. So today, in her current role as the institutional banking group head, the group accounts for about 90% of the bank's income. She works to activate the bank's digitalization strategy. And over the years, she has also been involved in various businesses, financial matters for large firms, SMEs, and even on transition to lower carbon business models, solutions for that for the businesses. And the DBS group said that her appointment comes after a 10-year process of finding a successor, and she was put through extended development program and also benchmarked against any external potential candidates. And they are satisfied that she is the right person for the job.
The macro economy will change. Generative AI will change a lot of the way we work. But what doesn't change is our culture and the collaborative spirit that enables us to be agile, that enables us to adapt, and enables us to transform when we need to. So the way we continue to adapt to new technology will change. And we want to be at the forefront of that. But our culture of putting the customer first, being collaborative, being purpose-driven, that won't change.
Right, so Joel, as you have rightly mentioned, that the timeline for the succession is that Piyush Gupta is set to step down around March next year at the annual general meeting. And for now, Tan Su Shan will step in as the deputy CEO on top of her role as the group head for institutional banking. And we'll see what are her priorities in later stories today.
Absolutely. Rebecca, thank you for reporting to us live from the DBS headquarters at Marina Bay Financial Centre. Now, A U.S. court has convicted a prominent China-born academic for being a covert agent. Prosecutors say the man pretended to be a pro-democracy activist in order to collect intelligence. 75-year-old Wang Shujun was convicted in a New York court. He is a naturalized U.S. citizen. The Justice Department says Wang co-founded a group, the Hu Yaobang and Chao Ziyang Memorial Foundation. He portrayed himself as a fierce opponent of China's communist government. Prosecutors argue that he was actually collecting sensitive information about members and reporting them to China's intelligence services. He is believed to be doing so since at least 2006, with the help of 4 Chinese intelligence officers who are at large and likely back in China. Wang faces up to 25 years jail when he is sentenced in January. U.S. Attorney Breon Peace says the indictment could have been the plot of a spy novel, but that the evidence of Wang's double life was shockingly real. More stories we're following for you this evening. The United States says China has committed to further regulate chemicals that are used to produce the illicit drug fentanyl. This follows discussions between officials last week on cracking down on the substance in China. A U.S. congressional committee claimed earlier this year that China was directly subsidizing the fentanyl trade, fueling a U.S. opioid crisis that killed more than 100,000 Americans last year alone. China has successfully launched the first 18 satellites of its new globe-spanning network known as the Tianfan constellation. It is said to be the first true competitor to SpaceX's Starlink. Beijing's plan is to put in orbit more than 10,000 satellites by 2030. In comparison, SpaceX's network currently has around 5,500 satellites. China's military in January described Starlink as a threat based on its use by Ukraine in its ongoing war with Russia. A building in China's Guangdong province collapsed on Tuesday after an explosion caused by a gas leak. State media says the incident killed at least 3 people and injured 1. Footage obtained by Reuters showed the moment the explosion occurred, followed by the collapse of the building in a cloud of dust. Eyewitnesses reported seeing residents standing atop the rubble, trying to rescue those trapped beneath. Local authorities reported that at least 4 people were trapped in the rubble immediately after the incident. That is East Asia Tonight. Singapore viewers, do stay tuned for highlights from the Paris 2024 Olympics. Don't forget, headlines anytime, CNA.Asia, Facebook, YouTube, and we're also on X. Bye-bye.